right. Hello, everybody. This is Kyle Cronin. I'm with the New Jersey Water Supply Authority. I'm going to get us going here today for today's webinar, which focuses on organic pest management in your yard, as well as a plant this, not that section. We are going to have two speakers today. The first one, Daina, is an environmental educator with Raritan Headwaters. She's also a master gardener, master food preserver, and a chemical engineer. She has a lot of experience working in school gardens, children's gardens, and with her own home garden. And she will speak first on organic pest management for your yard. Secondly, we'll have Rebekah, who is the stewardship manager at Raritan Headwaters. She looks over 1,100 acres of RHA's preserves and easements. She also conducts rare and endangered plant surveys for the NJDEP and is a plant expert. I am very excited to hear from both of these presenters today. Also, just advertising our next two webinars. Next week, we're going to have harmful algal blooms and aquatic invasive species. 2 weeks from now, May 27th, we're going to have groundwater protection and well stewardship. If you had signed up from this from an earlier presentation, advertisement, the groundwater and protection especially was just added to the sign up about a week ago. So if you are interested in that, please go back to that same link and or raritanheadwaters.org/calendar to sign up for that presentation. A little bit about the River Friendly Partnership real fast. We are a partnership made up of the Watershed Institute, Raritan Headwaters, and the New Jersey Water Supply Authority. We focus in the Raritan Basin region of central New Jersey, but we are welcome to working with and lending river-friendly tips and water quality and water supply tips to anyone around the state, or I think even some of the people signing up for these webinars have been from Pennsylvania, so we like you too. This is a certification program for golf courses, businesses, schools, residents. You can visit our website at njriverfriendly.org for more information on that website. This is the landing page for the website. We also have a community partner program, which works with small businesses and businesses that may not have a typical campus size or religious entity, things like that. The River Friendly Resources page will have all the information that we give out here today, as well as a link to the YouTube should anyone need to leave early today. And a bit of housekeeping real fast. We ask that you keep yourself on mute to keep background noise to a minimum. If you are having trouble, if your computer is not working well with audio, you can click these circles on the bottom. If you hover the bottom, that gives you options. And if you click the three little dots, that'll give you an option for audio connection. If you click that, you will be able to enter your phone number and the service will call you. So if you put your phone on speakerphone, you'll be able to hear as well. So with that,
Kyle, can you make it full screen?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. You see that real fast? Oh, sorry. Finish it. It's going to get bigger once I switch. I'm going to switch presenting now to, I'm going to stop sharing myself, and we're going to give the first presenter, Daina, I'm switching, Daina, I am switching you to presenter now if you want to take over.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Daina Gulbis, and I will be the first of your presenters today. So here we go. Okay. Let's see. I forgot how to do this. Oh, okay. There we go. All right. Can everybody see my presentation? Of course, I can't hear anyone else.
I can see it. I can see it. It looks fine.
Sure, it's Okay. All right. Okay. This is my first WebEx presentation. So we're going to talk about organic pest management today. And as Kyle said, I am an environmental educator at Raritan Headwaters. So when putting this together, I thought we should probably talk about, or at least mention, integrated pest management first, which is IPM, which is basically the methodology that's used across the U.S. And that would be here kind of like a scientific method. You identify your pests so that you can understand their habits and their life cycles. And then you want to see if you can prevent it or limit the damage based on that information. Of course, you want to use least toxic methods first, and then monitor and see what's going on. And then, of course, tolerate is an important one. Set your threshold of what you're able to tolerate. So a good example of this would be the cornworm, which eats only the smallest ends of the corn. Can you tolerate this pest without using chemical means? Or when you harvest your corn, you'll just cut off the ends and then cook them up for your barbecue. So tolerate is an important portion here. And then always using chemical means is the last option. Of course, this is integrative pest management. So we're going to talk about organic pest management, which is basically the same methodology. And in that, chemical treatments that are used, which would be either your fertilizers or your pesticides, would be or are derived from natural substances rather than synthetic substances. So for today, we are actually going to focus on organic pest management being as a non-chemical pest management. And as a part of the watershed organization, we do everything in our power to keep the lands and the water within our watershed safe. So I will personally not be recommending any pesticides or fertilizers in this presentation. We will really be looking at all the other means that you can look at to look at your garden as a whole. But we will send along recommendations and refer you to our New Jersey Ag Extension fact sheets. And some of those fact sheets do actually have suggestions for both organic and synthetic pesticides, which is really then your personal choice in how you go through the methodology. So what are pests? By the Oxford Dictionary definition, pests are a destructive insect or other animal that attack crops, food, livestock, and such. So pests of the garden, particularly the vegetable garden, or actually any garden that you have, include deer, rabbits, birds, groundhogs, squirrels, and smaller creatures. So we are actually going to focus more on these smaller creatures. So how do you identify your pests? First of all, you always need to visit your garden, which probably a lot of us are doing these days. And then identify any unknown insects that might just show up, because sometimes they just show up one day because they've emerged from the soil or their eggs have hatched. So what if you don't see any insects at all? Then you need to become a plant detective. And yes, that could mean that you go out with your magnifying glass and look at what's going on in your garden. Which plants have damage? And this is very important because plants are in different families and some pests like certain families better than others. What type of damage is found? Do you have holes in the leaves? Do you have foliage that's missing? Or does everything look okay, but your vine just looked like it died overnight? And then look for any evidence of pests. And this would be any pellets that you find, any slimy debris. We'll talk about that as we talk about the different pests. These are not all the plant families. I am very aware. I am listing these because these are the typical plant families that a lot of pests seem to like. So we have the brassicas, which are your cabbages, your broccolis, your cauliflowers. Then we have the cucurbits. And those are your squashes, pumpkins, cucumbers, gourds. I cannot say Fabaceae. Someone else will say it for me. Those are your legumes, the beans, peas, and clovers. And then you've got your solannas, or your salacious plants, also called nightshades. Eggplants, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, and ground cherries. And also tobacco is included in that family. So just kind of understanding these, keep them in the back of your mind as we go through the common garden pests. So in researching this, I went through a lot of different information, and we could talk about garden pests all day. However, I am just going to list pretty much the top 12, and they may or may not frequent your garden the way they may frequent a friend of yours that lives in a different location. But these seem to be the typical ones that affect gardens, vegetable garden plants. So we're going to talk about each of them and then talk a little bit about the methodology and go from there. So the first one is the aphid. If you take a look at our picture, I don't know if I can get a pointer. Here's the pointer. Take a look at the picture, and you have a pear-shaped small insect, and they are actually found in many colors: red, yellow, green. Some are pink, some are black, some are brown, and some are orange also. You may see them on some of your milkweed plants. So they have piercing mouth parts that extract the juices from the stems or the undersides of leaves. So if you have a lot of them, they could cause yellowing, wilting, and obviously some damage on your plants. So what do? Methodology would be to remove your garden debris and any diseased plants. A lot of people mention, and this is actually mentioned in a lot of the agricultural extension sites too, spray with a water hose. Just spray them down to get them off of your plant. Plant-resistant varieties, that also is an option. And then attract beneficial insects. And the second half of the presentation from Rebekah will be concentrating a little bit more on that. So you have some that are a little bit more of a holistic kind of perspective, which is an overall, and then some that are a little bit more specific. Asparagus beetle. So there are two different kinds. There's the spotted asparagus beetle is on the top, and then just the plain old asparagus beetle is on the bottom. They are only a 1/4 inch long, and obviously you can tell one has yellow spots, the other one's red with black spots. They feed on asparagus, and they'll feed on the young shoots, and they will cause deformed shoots. They'll lay eggs that are standing up on the ends of the spears. So, I'm sorry, standing on end on the spears. So if you're looking at the spears and you kind of look and see, looks like there's horizontal hairs maybe coming out of your asparagus, that may be eggs from asparagus beetle. So here, cultivate and fertilize for healthy plants. Harvest asparagus daily. Don't leave them out there too long. If they're done, if they're ready, bring them in. Handpick larvae and adults and then discard them. The spotted asparagus beetle will actually burrow into the asparagus berries later on in the season. So you want to remove those if you see that you have some insect activity. And again, they are eaten by other insects. So if you attract the beneficial insects, then you can help reduce the number of your asparagus beetles. Cabbage looper. So the cabbage looper, the adult is a gray-brown moth. The larvae look very similar to the one in this picture. Sometimes they're a little bit more green with white stripes on either side. And typically you'll know them because they have 3 pairs of front legs and 3 pairs of hind legs. So when they move, they release 1 pair, and that's kind of how they look like they're looping around instead of just crawling. So they feed out on the outer edges of the plants, and they leave evidence behind. So they leave pellets behind as they eat towards the center. So they do like cabbage and that whole family. So what they will do is start with the leaves on the outside of the plant, and as they eat and burrow further into it, you will see not only the hole, but you'll also see all the pellets left behind. What do we do here? They do not overwinter, but it's always good to remove the garden debris if you have any. Hand pick the larvae and crush the eggs if you can find them. And also use floating row covers to protect from the moths. So the moths arrive towards the end of July. So you have plenty of time to have all of those crops be pollinated by the bees. And then you can put your floating row covers on to help protect them from the moths laying eggs. Here is Colorado potato beetle. So I have all of the different stages. The eggs are deposited on the underside of leaves. So you can look for a mass that looks similar to the top picture here. Then in the larval stage, they look like this, bright yellow. I'm sorry, they look like this, a little bit more, I'd say a little bit more ugly, but they are beautiful in their own way, I guess. And they are light with dark spots. And then the last one is the adult. And that one is bright yellow with 10 black lines on the wing covers. So they do overwinter in the soil. They'll emerge in the spring, and they will have a second generation emerge in the late summer. So what do? As you can see, the larvae doing right there, they defoliate your plants. Their favorites are potatoes, but they will go and move on to eggplants and tomatoes and all the other nightshades. So what's the best way is still to handpick the adults and larvae, crush any egg masses that you may see. You can also use crop covers to protect from any of the flying beetles. And if you turn the soil over early in the spring, and I probably should have listed that one first, for bird predation, which means that if you turn your soil over as soon as it's workable, your birds, and if you have any chickens at home, will happily go through and usually pick a lot of the grubs and things out of the soil. So that also helps. Next is our cucumber beetle. It is a beetle that's about 1/4 inch long, and it's yellow and black, striped or spotted. So again, as you can see in the picture, they damage the foliage, feed on stems and leaves. Their eggs are deposited in the soil near the base of the plant. And curcubits are their favorite. If we remember what curcubits are, those are the squashes, pumpkins, gourds, watermelons, cantaloupes. So promote strong, healthy crops. This kind of goes along with any of these. As long as your garden is nice and healthy and these plants are growing and they're vigorous, a lot of times if you don't have a huge infestation of pests, they can handle some pest damage. Of course, handpick the adult beetles, cover and protect your seedlings. Many times they're the most vulnerable when we first plant the garden, and we might just be waiting for them to grow and maybe we don't go out as often. So cover and protect your seedlings. Again, this one suggestion here is that you turn over your soil early. Yep. And the other suggestion here too would be plant your solanaceous plants far from each other, because then they will most likely not hop as much from one to the next. So cutworms, they are 1 to 2 inch long, smooth, hairless caterpillars. This particular one is the cornworm that I mentioned, I believe, earlier. They are drab brown, gray. They have stripes on either side as well. They typically cut off plant stems near or below the soil surface. They do overwinter in yard debris, and they appear in May. They feed at night, and then they bury themselves in the soil by day, or at least they're harder to find by day. They like your cabbage, your cucumbers, potatoes, squash, and corn, which kind of falls across a couple of those favorite family groups. One thing that does really help with this is putting collars around your seedlings. And when I say collars, a lot of times you have your seedlings out there, the toilet paper rolls or your paper towel rolls, if you just cut them and then put them into the soil around the seedling, that usually wards off any of these cutworms. That helps a lot. Hand pick and discard, of course, if you find them. Flea beetles. These are small insects. I believe in this picture, if I'm correct, the top one is a spinach flea beetle, and the bottom one is a crucifer flea beetle. And they have strong hind legs, so they will jump and they will look like fleas. There are many different varieties. and they all do the same thing. They chew a lot of small little holes in the leaves, and they will basically stunt your plant growth. So they eat corn, curcubits, tomatoes, and cabbage. So again, falls across a couple of those plant families we mentioned in the beginning. Protecting young plants with row covers helps. They can overwinter in protected places and then emerge early in the spring. So they might feed on your weeds and things like that around before they see that they are viable seedlings. The other suggestion for this is to plant seedlings in your garden versus the seeds, because the flea beetles are so small. They say that the small seedlings are a little bit more susceptible than just putting seedlings in, because they have a little bit more vigor already. Leafhoppers. There are many, many different leafhoppers. These are pictures of, I believe, a potato leafhopper, and I am not an entomologist, so if someone wants to correct me, that'd be great. The top is a nymph, and it's wingless and light yellow to green. The bottom is an adult. They're pretty small. They're only 1/8 of an inch long, usually. They eat, again, across our favorite families: beans, carrots, celery, eggplant, lettuce, rhubarb. They can overwinter. So I believe they can overwinter. You want to remove your winter weeds and your debris. So you can plant resistant varieties of plants, and you always want to remove any disease plants that happen to die, and then protect with row covers. Slugs. They are mainly a problem during the wet seasons. They have rasping mouth parts, and they scrape along the plant tissue and then cause damage that way. So they usually feed on young plants, especially during very moist or wet conditions. And usually you're going to see the slugs before any damage occurs, because they don't move too fast. And if you don't see them, you will see a pretty evident clear or silvery slime trail. There's a couple suggestions here. Would be also good garden health. Helps to reduce populations. So if you increase your air movement between your plants, reduce any of those moist habitats, don't crowd your garden beds, then that will obviously help. Remove them by hand. You can repel them or try to repel them with a wood ash border, protecting your young plants. And then another favorite is they are very attracted to mulch. So taking a pie plate and digging it into just below the surface of the soil, that will attract the slugs, and then you'd have to change that pie plate and discard the slugs. The other suggestions would be you can put out a wood board, and then usually the slugs like to congregate together in dark, moist places, so you may turn over the board and see that there's a couple slugs that have been hanging out there. So that is also a suggestion. Squashvine borer, and there it is. That is the picture in the top is the larval stage, and they are voracious eaters. And then the bottom is the adult stage. So they will tunnel into the stems, leaving behind small holes. And in this case, it is not so much pellets as it is this greenish, yellowish, slimy excrement kind of coming out of some of those holes. So they are very destructive to squashes and pumpkins. And the plant, this is where I kind of mentioned before, you may come out one day, and if you don't take a look and you don't see, or you're not watching out for them, you might come out the next day and your plant may have suddenly started wilting on one end of the vine. So planting resistant varieties is always an option. Discard any harvested vines immediately, so there is nowhere for them to go, no hosts for them. Row covers to prevent moth access, of course, after pollination. Bury the vines periodically to encourage roots. So if you have a long vine going across your bed, every now and then where there's a good spot, you can bury the vines and that'll encourage root growth. So you have one portion of your vine that does get wilted or affected by the squash vine, then hopefully you can still get the rest of the vine to live for the rest of the season. There is also an option to remove the borer from the stem, which might be a little bit more difficult. If you're not quite sure exactly where they are, they're not always exactly as obvious as the picture inside, but rotate the crops. This is very important, and I know sometimes we have garden limitations. I do myself. Rotating crops is important because a lot of these pests that like certain plant families, once they're established, they may overwinter in those areas. So here, in the case of the squashvine borer, they actually, after they're done for the fall season, they will go into the soil and they will spin a cocoon and they will winter there after they exit all those stems. So it's very important to make sure that we rotate the crops. So if you don't put squash or anyone in that family, any curcubits back into that, then if you did have some overwinter, then you have a better chance of a different family not getting infected. Okay, so now we have the tomato tobacco hornworm. This is a very large caterpillar with diagonal white stripes, red horn on the tail end. This can cause significant loss of tomatoes and tobacco crops. So they also say that they hide during the day, although I have seen them out during the day, and then they feed at night. So hand pick and discard, unless of course they're covered in white ovals, which is the second picture here below. The smaller picture, those are actually wasp eggs. So that's a parasitic wasp. And so that tomato tobacco hornworm will not survive. And you can pick it if you wish, but it's already naturally going to stop eating your tomato plants. Rotate crops. Again, this is going to be the solanaceous family for these hornworms. So you want to rotate your crops and get a different family of crops in there so that if they do come back, then you do not have them in that same bed, because they can overwinter in tomato beds. And turning over the soil in early spring for bird predation. Again, this is one of those things that if you do this early in the spring before anything else is planted, you can allow the spring birds or your hen flock find some of those, or you might find them yourself as you're turning them over. The last one I'm going to add is whiteflies. Whiteflies are usually found on the underside of leaves in adults, about a 1/16 of an inch long. They suck the juices from the plants and leaves. They leave honeydew on surfaces, and that could cause the sooty mold just because it's so sticky. The plants will wither, they'll lack vigor, and they'll probably turn yellow. So whiteflies, most likely, if you get them outside, most likely came from a plant that was grown in a greenhouse. So one of the top things to look for is if you go to get your plants from a nursery or somewhere else, inspect the plants before you bring them home, before you plant them outside. Whiteflies are very common in greenhouses, and there are various different ways to take care of them. You can also use row covers, or spray the affected plants with just a detergent and water mixture, and see that should smother them and help you deal with them. But usually if you touch your leaves and you have a little cloud of tiny little flies come up, those would be your whiteflies, but they can be quite damaging. So I listed this here just because as I was going through and reading different things, I came across this table from Purdue University Extension, entomology. And this is just a quick list of very typical vegetable plants and how often they may see insect damage. So you can see down this list. these might help you to look at the things that you purchase. And if you do like these because you want to grow corn or you really want your cucumbers, and a lot of these we typically would have in our gardens all the time, then these would be the ones that under the usually or always column that you definitely want to take a look at. And I will answer questions if that's okay at the end, because it's hard for me to do both, but I see that there must be some questions up there. Okay, so summing all of this up, which really kind of falls back in line with the whole integrative pest management, that whole scientific methodology of going about putting in a garden. Make sure you just have good garden sanitation. A lot of times by the time fall comes around, I have also been guilty of this. We don't always clean all our vines away, or you know what, I'll do that later. And then suddenly it gets to be later, which means the spring, and I'm only cleaning my garden now. So good garden sanitation is good. Spring soil tilling. Tilling as soon as the soil becomes workable, and I turn it over by hand with a pitchfork or however you do that. And that way you can also expose anything that may have overwintered. And specifically, if you go back and look at that list, if you look at some of the things that overwinter that may affect your tomatoes or your potatoes or something like that, then you can actually look in that bed and see if you find anything, and then you can discard those. Good garden planning involves crop rotation. Again, sometimes we love to just put peas in one spot, or tomatoes always are better in that bed because it's further away from the door. So these are some of the things we want to take into account, because if we have all of these things from a holistic approach, that will help us manage our pests better. Purchasing plants from good sources, like I mentioned just a little bit ago, make sure you look at the plants and how healthy they look, and on the undersides of leaves. Most of these pests will leave their eggs on the undersides of leaves. So just don't bring any pests home to your own garden. Choosing resistant varieties. This is, of course, a personal choice. You want those heirloom tomato seeds, purchase the heirloom tomato seeds and just make sure you watch them. That's what I grow in my garden. Just keep an watchful eye and see what's going on. Protecting young seedlings is always something that we should look out for, not just for the insects, but of course, if you have any four-legged creatures that may come into your garden, like rabbits or squirrels, you want to make sure that you protect your young seedlings or watch over them at least. Row covers, again, you want to make sure that the row covers are off so that the bees can get in and pollinate, but then put the row covers on. And this goes back to understanding the life cycle of any of these pests, that you put the row covers on after you know your plants have been pollinated, you can see that they're fruiting, and now you know that that moth might be coming out and looking for places to deposit its eggs so that the squash vine borer can be born. So again, looking at the holistic approach. Handpicking and discarding larvae adults. This is something that is mentioned in pretty much every single one of the extension tables as an option. When you see them, you discard them, and in whatever manner you choose, and that way then they are no longer there. It's purely mechanical. Harvesting fruits, vegetables, seeds, and pods when they are ripe. Sometimes we get to the point at the end of the season where there are too many tomatoes, and I've also been guilty of this. You have a tomato and you meant to pick it, but somehow didn't, and now it looks like, you know, it's going to fall off the vine by itself, or it fell on the ground, and now it might attract different pests. So you want to make sure you keep that garden clean, kind of going back to garden sanitation. And then the last one is attracting beneficial insects. And those beneficial insects actually like to eat many of the pests that we talk about. So we will be discussing that shortly. I wanted to, let me see, my slides are not moving forward. My computer got stuck from Okay. So I found this old proverb, the best fertilizer is the gardener's shadow. And I thought that was very go out and pay attention and look around and see your own garden and know what's in your own garden. I think the better off you are to be able to manage the various pests in your garden. So the last one I have is just bibliography and resources. So here's a couple of things that I use. And of course, here we'll forward this is the Rutgers publication link. And I will forward that as well. Okay. Let's see. And all right. Kyle, you want to take over?
Sure. So we get a couple of questions that came in. I think you ended up talking about it later in the webinar, but one of them was what exactly is a floating row cover, or if you want to go a little more into that.
Sure. I can't see the option of unsharing my screen, so unless you can turn that off for me.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's you're not sharing anymore. So
okay, good. Okay, good. Yeah, floating row covers really look like. I think the best analogy I can use is they look like landscaping fabric, except they're white and very thin. So it's the same type of material, and usually you can put them and put them across the crops so they still allow the sun in. However, they will limit any creatures that will get into the row. Does that help? I don't have a picture of them, but that would be, yeah.
Okay. Somebody was just wondering, like, so how do insects always find their way to your plants?
That is a great question. I guess that's their life and what's built into them. I think that's probably similar to why butterflies always are able to find the proper nectar host plants. It's the same to me. Like I said, I'm not an entomologist, but the way I would see it is that they are very similar to other creatures. They're looking for their own host plants. So in those plant families, they have plants that they prefer. So if there's a chance that they've overwintered, they're specifically looking for that. Most of them are flying as adults, so they have their own way, I'm assuming. And like I said, not an entomologist, very similar to how butterflies find their own hosts for their eggs and their caterpillars. I'm assuming that most of these pests and insects are very similar. And if there's an entomologist in the group, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, great. One more, and then while you're answering, I'm going to give Rebekah the presentation ability so she can start loading up her screen.
Okay.
So our last question is, will turning over soil in the spring and allowing birds/chickens to forage grubs potentially do a lot of damage to beneficial soil bugs?
That's that's a good question. I mean, I have hens and I let them go in after I'll turn over my beds and I'll let the hens and go scratch in. I do only let them in there for a certain amount of time. So I think that helps. Because then you'll know I know personally if they're in there too long, they're digging to the depths, and I think I don't want the worms to disappear either. So, but that is a good question. I would say just limiting the amount of time that they go in there would be that's how I deal with that.
Okay, and one more quick question came in, and then we'll have Rebekah start. Somebody was saying that they know we were talking about insects today, but would you happen to have any suggestions for groundhog deterrents?
I knew that was going to come up. I personally don't have any groundhogs, but I can look through all the information that I already researched, and we can certainly send out some links with some options for what to do with groundhogs. Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, so that will all be in a follow-up email, as well as a link to this as a recording, and also the slides from today, because I know there was a lot of great information there that you probably didn't have a chance to all memorize real fast, but might want to go back and refer to later. And with that, Rebekah, if you want to start, we're all ready to go. I think, oh, Rebekah's on mute. Rebekah, you ready?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, can hear you good.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Daina. That was really informative. I hope that what I have to talk about today can help us control those pests even further. Hi, everybody. My name is Rebekah Buczynski. I'm the Land Stewardship Manager for Raritan Headwaters. I'm responsible for protecting and restoring the land in the natural areas of the Upper Raritan watershed. On 9 properties, they range in size from 11 to 170 acres, situated in Hunterdon, Morris, and Somerset counties. And these properties, like many of the natural areas in our state, although they're considered protected from human-made disturbances such as development, they're far from protected from the invasion of many non-native species of plants that have escaped our lovely yards and gardens over the past decades and have had a bit of a free-for-all ever since. No one person or group is to blame for these escapees. I think we might all have had a small hand in this mess. Exotic plants can be eye-catching and even mesmerizing, and I admit that I had very little idea of what an invasive species was 20 years ago and probably contributed to their spread more than once or twice. Now, as a steward of natural lands, I get to see firsthand and try to manage the years of unchecked invasion and seeing the negative impact it has not only on other plants and all the living things that depend on them, but on the overall health of the land and in turn even the health of our water. So I want to share with you some alternative ideas for plants that are locally adapted to a watershed area or county that you live in that can replace an existing invasive plant in your landscape, or be purchased for new plantings instead of buying one of the many commercially available non-native ornamentals. I want to focus on the aspect of planting species that are hyper-native, like indigenous to your county or watershed area, and sourced from local native plant nurseries who propagate and grow on site using locally and sustainably harvested seed. Species considered to be invasive they typically lower the overall plant diversity by outcompeting native and less aggressive introduced species in the garden. When our homes and businesses are landscaped with these aggressive species, it not only compromises the species diversity of native plants, but all the wildlife with which they co-evolved to depend on for survival. Planting a diverse array of natives in your yard can attract pollinators and birds that can ultimately help you with the pollination and the pest control in your vegetable garden. Insects that are generalists, like the bumblebee, who can visit up to 12 plants per minute and have been known to work 10-hour days in favorable weather, feel free to calculate the plants they can pollinate in that time. So that's just one of the reasons why it's so important to plant for wildlife and with a variety of native plants, with a variety of forms known to play host, supply food, and provide shelter for local fauna. Diverse groupings of plants whose flowers range in colors and shapes and bloom at different intervals throughout the seasons will keep a steady stream of inquisitive beneficial insects and other species coming back for more throughout the year. However, I want to touch on the point of one native species of wildlife that's currently beyond its historic population numbers due to many man-made factors that I won't go into right now, but I can link to some published studies for you to read. The white-tailed deer have been making negative impacts on native plants in our landscape, which is making even more room for invasive plants to take a foothold in natural areas. So I strongly encourage anyone who is managing plants in the landscape from a small yard up to a large forest to make a concerted effort in protecting these important native plants from deer browse, be it just putting shelters around individual trees that you plant or installing exclosure fencing over a several-acre woodlot. The contrast between the species-rich inside of a deer exclosure and the barren of all but invasive plants outside is pretty stark. I'd like to mention that some of the points I just discussed were brought up last week and 2 weeks ago in 2 other river-friendly webinars, the first of which I highly recommend as incredibly useful when it comes to the nuts and bolts of managing invasive plant infestations. I won't go into detail about methods for removing the ones I have up as examples, but I'll steer you to the experts who I regularly consult for advice on these matters, and the Director of Stewardship for Friends of Hopewell Valley Open Space, Dr. Mike Van Cleef, also the head of the New Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team, spoke extensively in the April 22nd webinar on invasive plant species in the state and how to control for them using the most up-to-date and carefully targeted methods. Because of these invasive plants, why are they still so popular? Because of their inherent ability to tolerate a wide variety of soils, even soils bereft of microorganisms and micronutrients that many plants depend on. Many invasive plants have been the landscapers' go-to for decades. Not all non-native plants that are wreaking havoc in the wild are still hot commodities, though. Some are even difficult to find for sale because the native plant movement is picking up. And several states have passed laws against the sale and transport of many invasive plants. For example, just last month, the state of Indiana passed a ban on the sale of 44 different species of invasives. But as we're the garden state, demand is pretty high for landscape plants, and because the sale of them is one of the state's big incomes, banning popular species could lead to significant financial losses, along with the loss of having to destroy enormous amounts of nursery stock. It's those plants declared outlaws in our surrounding states, but still readily available for purchase in New Jersey's nurseries and via the internet that I want to examine. Online retail giants like Amazon, as well as flea market-esque sites like eBay or its craftier counterpart Etsy, are selling plants shipped from who knows where and sourced from anywhere in the world. So because they're legal to sell in New Jersey and people are buying them, producers continue to stock known and potentially invasive species. However, keep in mind, many commercial nurseries sell to a broad audience and can ship to all over the world. What's highly invasive in one country or region can be docile in another. Some localities place restrictions on what plants can be shipped to that region, and you can see that some online sellers, like this disclaimer I found about invasive yellow iris, they openly acknowledge the no ship to rule. Some explain why, and others are kind of vague when it comes to the reasoning behind the restrictions. So it's really up to the consumer to own the responsibility of what is planted on their land, because it not only influences the health of your property, but of your neighbor's property, the lands downstream, and really any place on the land that wind, birds, or beasts can carry seed to. So Dr. Mike Van Cleef suggested any new plantings to be implemented in the state should be all native moving forward, and I hope that the state passes legislation for this sometime soon, and I'll talk more about that and some other plant bills at the end. On top of that, I'm all for remediating past planting hubris as well. If it's possible to remove the offending plant, you can do one of two things. You can either let nature take back that space with whatever seeds may fall in the void, or you can replant with carefully selected native or groups of native plants that serve the same or similar role that the invasive plant did, but without all the ecological disruption. That leads me to the wonderful talk that Karen Waltzer of the Barnegat Bay Partnership gave last week on the many virtues of converting portions of your home lawn into gardens that function as mini ecosystems. Karen went through the process step by step, including a tutorial on how to use the Jersey Friendly Yards plant database to determine the best plants for different areas of the yard. So we can go a step further and get hyper-local with our native replacements so that we can attempt to give back what was originally in the landscape. I'll give examples of garden variety invasive species, all which can be purchased either online or at many brick and mortar nurseries and garden centers in NJ. Categorized by the basic growth forms or their ability to fulfill one or several of the various landscape habitats, ornamental shrubs, grasses, ground covers, trellis vines, traits like shade tolerant, wetland tolerant, require full sun, or exceptional fall foliage. I'll discuss the main reasons why these plants are popular in landscaping and then what ecological problems they each pose. Following each invasive species overview, I'll go over one or two examples of native alternatives that meet the same landscape needs we asked of the invasives, but with the addition of having native fauna associations. My examples today for native plant replacements are based on species that are documented as indigenous to one or more of the counties within the Upper Raritan watershed, and that can also be sourced from native plant nurseries in the area. It's helpful to understand where these plant invasions come from and observe trends where they're spreading by using online tools like the Invasive Plant Atlas. Sorry, now I need to remember how to switch the slides I'm sharing. Here we can look up an invasive that we saw a couple slides ago, Tree of Heaven. You can sort. Here we go, Ailanthus altissima, the distribution map. As you can see, Tree of Heaven is heavily reported to be invasive in the state of New Jersey. Oh, sorry, do you have a question? And all over the United States. Using the report sightings on the early detection distribution maps website, we can report any invasions that we see. We can do that also using the Friends of Hopewell Valley Open Space New Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team smartphone app that you can download and record any invasive species that you detect. And you can also use their species list with control recommendations. Again, I defer to the strike team for protocols for anything involving heavy artillery. Here we have two databases for finding replacement ideas, most of which are native. Today, we'll be delving.
Excuse me, Rebecca.
Hi.
I think that we cannot see the web page that you're showing us or presentation.
Oh no.
Screen. I know, I'm sorry.
Is it shared now?
Yeah, now I can see it. Thank you.
Were you able to see the presentation at all?
The PowerPoint we have been seeing, yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So just like a minute or two ago when you switched your screen, we weren't able to see that.
Okay, I'll go back through. Here's the Tree of Heaven distribution map, how to report sightings, how to report sightings using your smartphone through New Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team, their control recommendations. It's extensive. I won't go into detail on that. I recommend visiting that site to check on any invasive species you might have. Now we move on to choosing native plant replacements, the New Jersey Friendly Plant Database. Karen Waltzer went into great detail using that. We're going to go even further into detail with the Native Plant Society of New Jersey and their native plant resources to select plants that can offer ecosystem services to native wildlife and pest control in the garden. Unfortunately, very few native species have been studied for their pollinator interactions compared to the many European plants that have been known to be attractive to beneficial insects. So knowing this, we're going to apply a rule of thumb for attracting a wide variety of insects is by planting an even wider variety of plants in all shapes and colors, because our goal is for the success of the native plant, and we can achieve that through being hyper-native with the help of the USDA plants database. We can confirm where certain...
Hello?
Sorry, I guess I'm getting an echo. I thought I was getting a question. I apologize. Here I'm going to search for flowering dogwood and see if that is indigenous to the county that I live in. And here you can click on the map, zoom in until it's county level, And yes, Somerset County is known to be a place where native flowering dogwood grows. And it's also important to check the conservation status of species. Using the NatureServe Explorer, we can check to see if flowering dogwood is secure in our state. And it's not, it's secure, it's S5, so we don't have to worry about it being threatened or endangered. Okay. And now for our examples. So for a full sun flowering shrub, a really popular invasive plant is the butterfly bush, named for its ability to attract all the butterflies in the world with its copious amounts of nectar. One problem, though, is that it only attracts adult butterflies and does not play host to the larval stages of these butterflies. In this, it's disrupting local food webs because there's no caterpillars. The birds do not have the caterpillars to eat, and thus ecosystem collapse can occur. This plant can also readily invade disturbed sites, displacing native vegetation. So we want to replace it, but we want to replace it with something that attracts butterflies just as well. So how about the native butterfly weed, which we see is indigenous to almost every county in New Jersey. It is an actual host species for monarch and other butterfly for their larvae to feed on. It attracts a wide variety of bees, butterflies, flies, and hummingbirds. Specifically, we do know that it attracts the aphid-eating convergent lady beetles. So because butterfly weed does attract it does have aphids, the aphid-eating beetle will come, and hopefully when she runs out of aphids to eat on the butterfly weed, will move on to the vegetable garden. The color is just as beautiful, if not more, than the purple with the orange spot in butterfly bush, so I think it fulfills an aesthetic value as well. If you're looking for a plant that is an actual shrub, butterfly weed is a perennial herb. Although it's woody, it does not have shrub-like growth, so we can look for another plant. Here we've got steeple bush. It is a little less tolerant of soils that butterfly bush can handle, but it does grow in nearly every county in the state. It produces less nectar, but it does have abundant pollen. It is also host to the summer azure butterfly, so it is fulfilling an ecosystem role by providing habitat for larvae. So because it doesn't fulfill all the aesthetic requirements, it can't be planted in every single place that a butterfly bush could be planted because it likes a little bit more moist, acidic conditions. It's a good idea to pair this species with the butterfly weed and grow them throughout your lawn to attract a wider variety of native fauna. Our next species, we're going to be looking at the very elegant Japanese wisteria, which is grown for its dramatic effect and its cascading plumes of flowers that can be trained over a trellis. It's highly invasive. It sends out vegetative runners that travel along the ground, can cross creek beds, grow up and around trees, eventually girdling the trees by strangulating them with the tight vines, twirling counterclockwise up their trunks through their leaves that leaf out over top of the tree canopy and shading them, and thus killing the tree that way. It can change the whole forest structure by pulling these trees down eventually and creating light gaps where more invasive species can fill in where once native shade-loving species could live. And it is rampantly taking over many parts, actually a good deal of the counties in New Jersey have reported this species as invasive, and could be replaced by a very, very wild species, the riverbank grape. It's one of the only species of grape that I was able to find for sale in a retail setting from a native plant nursery. It's probably one of the less aggressive vining grapes, although it is a fast-growing vine. It does not tend to strangle trees. It grows up and it just kind of dangles on them like a fun vine you might want to swing on if you're walking through the woods, but you shouldn't because it could pull a branch down. The fruit that is created once bees pollinate the not very showy spring flowers. The fruit is actually a beautiful cascading plume of purple, similar to wisteria, so it fulfills an aesthetic value, while also providing host plant services for the lettered sphinx and the badwing moth. Next, people do tend to have a lot of ornamental grasses that as either accent pieces or bordering. Different garden beds. Chinese silvergrass, unfortunately, has been a super popular species. You can drive around and count the many hundreds of clusters of this in the yards in the nearby townships. And it's spreading pretty rapidly now. It's chosen because it's rather elegant and moves with the wind. It has interesting winter seed heads and should be replaced because its large clumps tend to naturalize in natural areas and displace native vegetation while also being highly flammable. So a good alternative to Chinese silvergrass is native Indian grass, which can also take on a lovely, elegant clumping form in cultivation with arching stems, and also has an interesting flowering head, which is a beautiful yellow floret that is nice and contrasting to the blue-green leaves of the foliage, which are fed upon by many, many, many species of grasshoppers, who in turn are eaten by many species of birds. The seeds are eaten by mammals and other birds, and the plant is an important host for pepper and salt skipper butterfly. For ground cover in shady places, periwinkle has been a staple in the landscape industry for forever. It blooms early, so we have pretty periwinkle flowers in March and also sporadically throughout the rest of the year. The foliage is normally evergreen, so it is truly a ground cover. It can tolerate complete shade and spreads rapidly, so you have ground cover instantly and forever pretty much with periwinkle. And because of that vigorous growth peel, it invades and spreads rapidly into natural areas outside of your garden. As you can see, most of the Northeast United States has it reported as invasive. So its advantage of being low to the ground and also evergreen means nothing is going to germinate beneath its leaves. So we need to kick it out and replace it with a species of phlox that is also evergreen, moss phlox, which blooms at around the same time and is similar in color, although it's a little bit more pink than periwinkle. It provides early season nectar for swallowtail butterflies, the day-flying sphinx moths, and hummingbirds. It's shade tolerant, but it flowers more in full sun. So that means we're going to have to find another species that fulfills this shade-loving aspect. So creeping phlox tolerates full shade, It can form dense colonies, so it's a taller ground cover, but might appeal as a height difference in a garden. It blooms a little bit later, so that's good to stagger the intervals of bloom time to attract more species, and it is attractive to hummingbirds and butterflies. For our striking fall foliage category, burning bush is seen all over the place in the state. People can't get enough of it. I guess the fall color is pretty nice, but the rest of the year it doesn't look very interesting to me. It's highly adaptable. It can grow pretty much everywhere and can be used for either a piece of interest in the garden or hedgerows and windbreaks. But it is very productive in its berries, and birds tend to eat the berries and spread them all over the place. As far as a bird can fly, that's how far away you'll find a baby burning bush. So it also spreads vegetatively. So it doesn't need birds to carry the seed, so it has the advantage of spreading in 2 different forms. So that gives it an upper hand in displacing native species. It can also have seed shadows under it, so its babies can germinate underneath it and stay alive until the mother plant passes away, and then you have 100 new seedlings there waiting to become adult plants. Here we have an example from another online source for plants that is a little more vague than the yellow iris example. Does not ship to these states. So that gives the buyer a clue. If you're looking at plants online and you see something like this, does not ship to, it's a good indicator that this species is probably threatening and probably has invasive aspects to it. An alternative to burning bush is the beautiful fall foliage created by red chokeberry, which is native in every single county of our state. It is a shrub, just like burning bush, excellent for creating hedges. It can tolerate almost any soil. Has just as beautiful and striking of a red fall color as burning bush does, but also has the added benefit of being host for several species of native moths, as well as being visited by pollinating bees in the spring. And lastly, our wetland habitat invader of the day, we have yellow iris, which has spread through our area, away from the gardens where it was originally planted for its pretty canary yellow color. It has a long bloom time, a whole month, May through June, maybe even 2 months, and has the ability to grow in wet areas where other plants won't be as happy. Its original range was a lot of Europe, Middle East, and North Africa, but now in the United States, it's spread, it's peppered throughout the middle states and well established in along both the coasts, where it can reduce habitat for fish and waterfowl by clogging up small streams, making it impassable for them to complete their reproductive cycles, and we're spawning upstream. And it also displaces other native wetland plants that native water fowl are dependent on for food and shelter. An alternative that's just as lovely, if not more so, is the blue flag iris, which also has a nice long bloom period in mid-spring and actually extends longer into the summer. It's wetland obligate, so it must be in a wet area for most of the year, where yellow flag iris can actually escape the wetland habitat and grow in drier conditions. However, Blue flag iris provides ecosystem services as nectar for butterflies and bumblebees. Bumblebees are the pollinators of it. As you can see, it has the landing strips for them to find where the nectar reward is. If you're not satisfied with the blue color of the blue flag iris and are really looking for a yellow plant to fulfill the space in your garden, the wetland area, then golden ragwort is a wonderful early spring blooming alternative. Blooms in early April, sometimes even as early as March, so it attracts the early pollinators and gives them something to eat. It can act as a ground cover, which is wonderful. Not a lot of native plants can be ground cover in the difficult wet and shady areas. It's specifically, it's in the genus of Pachyra. It's been known to be visited by aphid-eating hoverflies, so that's great for the veggie garden. And the family Asteraceae, the aster family, is one of the favorites of the tachnid fly. And they are a very important parasitizing species that controls soft-bodied insects in the vegetable garden like cabbage worms, Colorado potato beetles, corn earworms, cucumber beetles, cutworms, earwigs, floraline plant bugs, Japanese beetle grubs, Mexican bean beetles, sawfly larvae, squash bugs, and tobacco budworms. So I think it's an all-around amazing native replacement for the yellow flag iris. So for sourcing these native plants, just how native can you go? So a native plant, the definition is indigenous to a specified region over a specified period of geologic time. So you can really zoom in and zoom out when it comes to the nativeness of something. So we're interested in hyper-local native sourcing native plants. You want to look for nurseries or native plant sales held by local conservation organizations that grow their own stock. They tend to hold a high standard for how their nursery stock is propagated from sustainably and locally collected seed. Because it's known that the more locally adapted something is to its environment, the more co-evolved and the ability to interact with the other locally adapted species it will have. Some nurseries carry nativars. They were once wild types, but they're now cultivated for many years in the greenhouse environment and bred or selected for certain traits. The selecting for the same traits over time gives a nursery a consistent stock that customers are used to, but it limits the genetic variability of the stock. And the less genetic diverse a plant or a group of plants is, the less chance it has for success and adapting. The Native Plant Society of New Jersey has a terrific resource for finding the nursery most local to you. Here it's an Excel file that you can sort based on the name, the location, and my favorite part, the percentage of stock that is native. So you could look for 100% native. You can see if you can sort to see if they grow the stock on site or if it's brought in. And by doing that, you can really get to the most hyper-local and successful plants possible. And lastly, I want to bring up the sale of endangered or threatened plant species and ask you, will planting them everywhere help bring them back? New Jersey has pending legislation on limiting the sale and transport of state-listed rare and threatened species. Although the bill seems to put a limit on the plants that we would all love to enjoy for their rare beauty, like I, for instance, would love to have every single New Jersey orchid blooming in my yard, but I agree with this protective bill. A rare plant is rare because it has very specific ecosystem needs and exists naturally in usually specialized niches that harbor a certain light or fire regime or a hydrologic cycle, or it requires a bedrock or substrate that only occurs in small geologically based pockets of land in the state. In our tiny state, which is incredibly diverse for its size, development has occurred over many places that were once suitable habitat for these plants. But now, because the habitat is decreased, the species dependent on that habitat have followed suit. This law also protects those rare plants that are imperiled not because of ecological restrictions, but due to human encroachment in the places where they once grew, and by restricting trade, poor conservation practices like over-harvesting of seeds or poaching of entire plants will be better controlled. And I want to thank you all, and hopefully this will get you interested in making your own little ecosystems in your homes more attractive to native fauna by using native flora, and attracting all the beneficials that'll keep our vegetable gardens healthy and delicious this summer. All right, thank you, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rebekah. We have 2 quick questions, and then we'll wrap up for the day. So the first one was, would you suggest using cultivars of native plants in the home landscape?
When it's possible, I think it's best to use the wild types that are grown from seed collected in the area closest to you. Cultivars are fine. They just adapting might be a little more difficult for them, and the insects and other creatures that have had a relationship with the local ecotypes it's possible they might have less ability to recognize the cultivar as readily as they would recognize the local native species in its wild form. But a cultivar is better than an invasive plant. So yes, if you can't get the local genotype or ecotype, cultivar is the way to go too.
Okay, and then last question. Would you have any concerns about planting threatened or endangered plants? Would someone need to worry about nurseries harvesting them from the wild?
I think that we have to kind of use our intuition and better judgment, and if a nursery is local and they claim to have good conservation practices, like only harvesting 10% of seed from populations of plants that are healthy or locally abundant, there are ways to check. We can go through asking like the Natural Heritage Program and the State Department if they know of any harvesting that's been going on in certain natural lands, because they have a database. The biotics database has a catalog of the state endangered and rare species and where they occur in the state, and it's kind of a top secret list. So hopefully those that would be digging up entire plants rather than just carefully collecting percentages of seed could be caught and stopped. And hopefully with the new bill that might be passed soon, with the trying to ban the sale and trade of endangered plants in the state, it might decrease the act of poaching and hopefully increase the careful cultivation of seeds and maybe nursery stock that's already in place. Yeah, again, I would say planting a rare plant, it might do okay in your garden, but your garden might not have all of those many specialized needs that a rare plant requires. I hope that answered your question. I'm sorry, I kind of rambled on.
Okay, I think that's it for today. So thank you again to everyone who participated. Thank you to both of our speakers today, and we will be sending out a follow-up email with the materials that the speakers mentioned later this afternoon. So thanks again. Hope to see you next week with harmful algal blooms and aquatic invasive species, or in 2 weeks when we'll have groundwater protection and well stewardship presented by Raritan Headwaters groundwater protection employee. So thank you very much, and hope to see you next week.